Welcome back, everyone, and today we're going to continue on in our Intro to Reduce series. We're going to be talking about creating an asynchronous pipeline using Reduce. What is that? Well, we'll get to that here in a second. First, let's talk about the prerequisites. As always, I need you to have an understanding of JavaScript, especially ES6. I also would like for you to understand how promises work because I won't be covering that in this video. I also would hope that you've either, one, been following along in the Intro to Reduce series, or two, that you have an understanding of Reduce conceptually already. So the question is, well, what's a pipeline? And before we answer that, we need to talk about a concept that undergirds this whole idea. And this is very important. The output of one function can be the input to another. And I'll say it again. The output of one function can be the input to another. All right, so let's look at an example that will illustrate this better. Let's step through the code. So here we're just importing an add1 and a -1 function, looks like, from some file, some math file that presumably we've already written. And we're going to call add1 with the result of calling -1 with 2. And calling -1 with 2 will give us the result itself. It'll give us 1. And that will be fed in or piped as the input to add1. And that gives us 2. Okay, so we have our first pipeline here. Let's step through the code and see what's happening. So the first thing is we're going to create this function -1 add1 that is the composition of the functions that we were doing prior, right? So it's going to take some data, and what is it going to do? It's going to, it's going to do exactly what we were doing before, right? It's going to take the data, it's going to call -1 with that data, and the result of that will be piped into add1. And when we call it below with 2, well, we're going to get the same answer. Okay, so then what is a pipeline, right? It's kind of like another way of saying a function. It's a pipeline is a function that takes some data and it has a list of functions that it needs to call, and it will do so in order, and the output of one function will just become the input to another. Then that begs the question, if we know what a pipeline is, or I guess a synchronous pipeline, then what's an asynchronous pipeline? Well, for that, let's look at another example, and hopefully through juxtaposing these things, we can see the difference. Let's step through the code. All right, so it looks like we're still importing these math functions, but notice that they say async on the end. That's because they're asynchronous functions, and they're going to return promises, so that we'll have to call .then on them. All right, and we're going to create the pipeline much in the same way, but it's slightly different, right? Notice that we take some data here. We're going to create a function, take some data. We're going to call -1 async with that data, but because it returns a promise, we have to call .then, right, on the promise. But then we have access to whatever was the result, and we can pipe that in to the add1 async function, and that itself returns a promise. So then we can call this -1 add1 async, that's a long name, I know, with 2. And because that's going to return a promise, well, we can call .then on that and do whatever we want. In this case, we're just logging it out to the console. All right, so how do we do this for any number of functions, right? If I had a pipeline of 10 functions, say, that I wanted to create, how could I do that? Well, here's a few things to keep in mind. First, think of these functions as Lego blocks, right? They should be small and composable. That will definitely help. So this is the async pipe function that we're going to write. It's a higher order function. And if you don't know, higher order functions just mean that it either takes a function as input or it returns a function as output. Now this happens to just do both. So let's step through the code and kind of see what's happening under the hood. All right, so let's look at the first set of parameters here. Looks like we're using the spread syntax for this async functions. So all that means, if you don't understand this, is that you can pass in as many async functions as you want, and we'll collect it into an array so that we can iterate over it later. And calling that will return a new function that can be called later, right? Take some data, and it's going to reduce the array of asynchronous functions down to a single promise. So the benefit of breaking up the parameters like we've done is reuse. So if you notice, async pipe is a function that when called with some async functions as the first set of arguments you pass in, will produce a new function that takes some data. Here we've just called it x. This is also known as a curried function. If you're unfamiliar with curried functions, I have a video just on that all by itself, and I'll link to it below. Okay, so let's reduce. The first thing is, we have this constant thing we've talked about determining what the accumulator should be. Well, right now, we're going to need a promise. So to do that, I've just plopped x into using promise.resolve. And that doesn't change the data in any way, which is good. It just puts it into a promise that we can use throughout this function. Okay, so let's look at the reducing function, right? We have the same kind of concept, the accumulator and a current value, but now the accumulator is going to be a promise. And the current value is just going to be an asynchronous function. So since the accumulator is going to be a promise, we need to call .then on it, right? And we can pass in the current asynchronous function, and then we get a new promise, and that will be the new accumulator. So again, remember the job of the reducing function. It should return a new accumulator. In this case, we're collapsing this array of asynchronous functions down to one, and so it will return a promise. All right, let's look at this in action. Let's step through the code. Okay, so we're just going to import this add1async function from, again, some math file that we've written somewhere else. We have our async pipe function, which we've already talked about. And we have this new function that we're going to create called add2async. And that's going to be created by calling async pipe with add1async twice, right? So the act of calling async pipe and filling in that first set of arguments will produce a new function that when called will just sit there and wait to be reduced, right? So you can see we've called this down below. Add2async, we pass in 2, that returns a promise because async pipe will return a promise. Because it returns a promise, we can call .then on it. Here we're just logging it out to the console. All right, so let's look at a kind of real life example that might illustrate why you would want to use this, or even how you would. So we have this big blob of code. Let's step through it like always. Okay, so we have some imports here. These are all asynchronous functions. They're going to return promises, and they're likely to hit a server. We're also just going to import this async pipe function, and we're going to pretend like we stuck it in a utils file. And here's the payoff. This is what we were talking about earlier. We can reuse these small Lego blocks to create larger functions, right? Or more functions. So we have this get user send email function. That is the result of calling get user first and then send email. And then we have the send invoice for user, which is the result of calling get user first and then get orders for user and then send invoices. So this gives us a wide range of ability to create new functions from smaller ones. The idea of a pipeline is actually very simple. It's really just a function that takes some data and will call a series of functions passing the output of one as the input to another. And an asynchronous pipeline is really the same thing. Obviously it's implemented slightly different. It's implemented with promises, but it's really the same idea, right? Same concept. Now, I will say you could also use async await. That's just syntactic sugar for promises anyways. If you want to do that, or if you prefer that syntax, I just like the promise syntax. I'm not exactly sure why, but I like just being able to call .then on things. But you could certainly use async await, in lieu of promises or the promise syntax here. So hopefully you learned something, and if you did, leave me a comment below. And don't be afraid to hit those like and subscribe buttons, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.